Hi, it's Bob Walmsley here again from INSYDIUM with another official technical training video. So in this tutorial, we're going to be looking at recreating this cloth animation, which was featured in the xpReel reel. So we're going to bring in multiple planes here and use only one cloth deformer to make them all dynamic cloth simulations. We'll then bring in some modifiers to get some of that fluid movement, including a strange attractors, which is going to pull them away from the camera. We're then going to set up some dust particles, and these too are going to interact with the cloth to make it look like they're being pulled around by the turbulent air pressure the cloth movement is causing. So all of that to come, so let's get started. Let's build the scene. So what we need to do is start off with a plane, which is going to be our piece of cloth, obviously. Let's just press ND to have a look at the lines. So the plane wants to be, it doesn't want to be a square shape, so let's give it more width. Let's just say 1,000 centimeters width. So it's a nice long, huge piece of cloth. Great. So what we need to do is try and get these subdivisions as even as possible. So let's start off with, we're probably going to make these subdivisions even tighter later on, but we'll start with a lower amount of subdivisions, which means it's going to run and simulate much more quickly. So let's just up this to say 50 width segments and slightly fewer. I think let's say 80. I'm just get a guesstimate because my maths isn't very good. So that's looking pretty good. Even subdivisions on this plane. Right. So let's just look at how we create cloth. So you can create cloth manually and bring in all the various different elements you require in a manual way, or there's an automatic function. So what we can do at this stage is create our cloth now when we only have one plane in the scene. And then we can create multiple planes and use the existing cloth system. So it'll be an easier and quicker way of doing it. So what we'll do is have the object selected, go to xParticles, Dynamic Objects, Cloth Effects, and Create Cloth. Hit that, and automatically we get 5 elements added actually. We have these 4, constraints object, a gravity, an emitter, and a cloth modifier. And then as a child of the plane, we have got a cloth deformer. So you'll only get a cloth deformer in your scene if the object to which you're applying the cloth is a parametric object. And therefore it needs a deformer to identify where the vertices are. If it's a polygon object, you won't get this cloth deformer. You'll just get the cloth tag on the actual object itself. But this is useful that we have this cloth deformer because we're going to be able to utilize one of the advantages of that a little bit later. So the cloth surface, very briefly, the cloth, how it works. I'm just going to, if I press play now, the cloth is going to float away and fall off. And that's because we have a gravity in the scene. So I'm just going to disable the gravity. So what this cloth system is doing is it is created an emitter, and the emitter in the object tab is set to object emission, and it has the plane as that object, this plane here. It's set to emit from the points, and it's set to only emit from 1 particle per source element, so 1 particle per vertex. The emission is set to shot, and the radius is set to 3, but actually these elements are irrelevant at this point. So in the display settings, I'm just going to change it from dots to circles and then hit play again. And now you can see what's happened. So it's created a particle for every vertex of this plane, and it's set a particle radius so that they will slightly intersect with each other. And this is going to help with the collisions. And it's the particle position that is then deforming the plane and making it look like cloth. The constraints object, everything is off on this constraints object apart from the collisions. And this will stop the cloth from intersecting itself as it kind of wafts and bends around the place. That's what the constraints are doing. And the cloth modifier doesn't have any settings, but this is the engine. This is what you need in your scene for it to work. Good. So then all of this stuff is controlled. It controls the cloth modifier, which deforms the plane. So in this little cloth tag, you can see that it has the emitter in the emitter slot. This is the emitter that's been created. And with that in there, that means that the way in which these particles move are going to deform the plane and make it look like cloth. So what I'm going to do, let's just bring in a turbulence modifier, hit play, and now we can see that the turbulence is moving the particles, which in turn is deforming the plane. And that's it. That's how cloth works. Now I'm going to actually delete this gravity because we don't need it in this scene. So that's the thing to remember with cloth. And what makes the xParticles cloth really powerful is that it's particle driven. It's the particles that are doing the work, which means that we can use all of the control we have over particles normally with modifiers and questions and actions and all that kind of stuff. We can use that, and that'll have an effect on our cloth, which is really cool. So in our scene, we need our turbulence to be stronger and much bigger. So let's just bring this up to that and let's whack the strength up. So it's really starting to waft this cloth around the place. So that's good, but we don't quite want it to react as quickly. So I'm just going to go into my cloth settings and I'm going to just dampen the movement. Not by much. Let's just try with 5% first. You can see how that's dampened that movement slightly. And that is giving it more of a slower, more languid waft, which is going to work well for us a little bit later. Excellent. That's all we're going to do with a cloth. So really simple setup. But we need more than just one piece of cloth. We need a whole tier of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to use MoGraph to do this. So what we're going to do with our plane selected, we need to hold the Alt key, go to MoGraph and hit cloner. And it makes the plane a child of the cloner. All right. Now, it's cloned this plane, but if I hit play, it's not working. The cloth modifier isn't working. So what we need to do is just use the cloner to create all of the planes that we want and to position them in a nice random way. And then we're going to make that editable, which will actually make individual planes. So let's do instead of a linear cloner, we're going to go to grid array. And I'm going to have only 2 on the X and the Z, and 3 on the Y. This is how many copies we've got of the clones. So then if I increase the Y distance a bit, and then increase the X distance a lot, and the Z slightly less, because they're obviously thinner than they are long. So now we have made all of these clones. We've got 12, which will probably do us for this. So now we want to give them a little bit of random position. So we can do that with MoGraph really easily with the effectors. So with the cloner highlighted, I'm going to go to MoGraph and we need to go to the effectors. And what we're going to use is a random effector. So pick that one. Okay, so the random effector by default is affecting the position of these planes randomly on the X, Y, and Z axis. And you can see they're slightly being offset now. So that's actually quite good, what we want. So let's increase how much they're randomized on the Y. And the other 2 we can kind of keep. Let's just, we can put a little bit here just to randomize it, but it doesn't have to be too much. Okay. Maybe a bit more on the Y. And now we can randomize the rotation. So we'll select rotation and we can just add a little bit of random rotation to these, so they're not looking uniform. And what we want to do is avoid these intersecting if possible. So if you can see here, look, we've got one intersection and a big intersection here. So with this little one, where was it? There. This little bit of intersecting, I could probably just tweak one of these to get rid of that. Okay. And we've got one here. So cloners, if you do this, are always going to intersect with each other. But that's fine. because we can make these small adjustments. Now, let me just show you a trick with this one. So we've got a really big intersection here, which isn't looking very good, and it's going to be very difficult, actually, to push and pull this to try and make sure that that isn't intersecting. So let's sort that out. And the way we're going to do it is we go to the cloner, and we go to the transform tab of the cloner, and we want to make visible the weights of these clones. So let's go to show weight. And can you see each one now has a red dot? Excellent. So they all have uniform weight, these clones. They all have a weight of 0. And this means that when we bring effectors in, the effector will have an equal impact on every single one of these clones because they all have the same weight. But what I'm able to do, if I go to my MoGraph menu and I pick my MoGraph weight paintbrush, let's hit that, put the strength up to 100, and what I'm going to do with one of these intersecting planes, I'm going to paint that yellow. So now it has 100% weight. And can you see on the cloner, we have got this a weight map, which is saying it's basically a bit like a selection, really. So now if I bring in a plane effector into my scene, what's happening is this. If I go to the plane effector, you can see my weight map has automatically been put into the selection. So that means if I go to my parameter and to my rotation, this is only going to affect the one that we painted with weight. And that means I can adjust this clone on its own. I can do whatever I want with it without affecting the others, which is pretty cool. Maybe let's have it rotated the other way so it's slightly different to that one, and then kind of getting there. Okay, good. So no intersections. Fantastic. I mean, it doesn't really matter how careful you are here because we're not going to be rendering from this point. We need to allow the simulation to develop and the cloth to get the wrinkles before we're going to get to anywhere near the render point anyway. So this initial stage isn't actually that important, but it's a good idea to try and prevent those intersections if possible. Great. So we've already discovered that if we put this in a cloner and then have this cloth deformer active, it doesn't actually clone, doesn't respect it, and nothing happens, it doesn't work. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to make that editable, and that's going to create separately all of these different planes as individual objects, which is going to work really well for us. So let's do that. So what we're going to do is let's go to the cloner, drag out this cloth deformer and just stick it down here for now. Then what we're going to do is we will take the cloner object and I'm going to right click and I will current state to object, which makes a copy and it kind of makes it editable. So now we have a null called cloner, and underneath we now have all of these planes. So what I'll do is let's just switch that cloner off, make its contents invisible, move that to the top of the scene, and we can ignore that for now. We can go back to it should we need to make any adjustments. But now we have these objects. So these are now editable. These are editable polygon objects and they all exist. They're not just clones. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to place all of these into a connect object. So if you hold Alt when you've got that selected, and let's go to this menu here and click on connect. No, that doesn't work. Now, there is a shortcut where you are able to do that, and it doesn't produce a new connect object for every plane, but I can't remember what it is. So let's just undo that. I'll bring in a connect object. Let's make the connect object a child of this null, and then we'll take all of our planes and stick them into the connect object. So that's what we want. Okay, good. So then what we are going to do is we're going to make this cloth deformer a child of the cloner null. And so now we have our planes back. But because this is a deformer, this works like any other deformer in Cinema 4D, and it will now affect all of the objects that it is a sibling or child of. So now if we hit play, nothing happens. Why not? Well, we need to make one change. If you remember at the beginning when we first created our cloth on our single plane, we looked in the emitter that was automatically created, and in the object tab, the plane was put in there and we got the particles on the plane, and this is still in the emitter. So at the moment, all of our new planes that we created aren't emitting any particles, and so they can't interact with the cloth, and so they won't work. So we just need to make that change. We need to change it from this plane to our new connect object, which is housing all of our new planes. So let's just drag that connect object in. I'm just going to deactivate the constraints because there's lots of collisions going on now, and that'll slow it down at this point. And now if we hit play, there we go, we're getting it. So we've got one cloth tag, one cloth deformer, but it's affecting all of these 11 planes. Excellent. And they're all kind of acting independently of each other, and they're being affected all by the turbulence in our scene. So that's looking good. Excellent. So we're there with our basic setup for the stuff that we want to manipulate. So in the scene that we're recreating, obviously we have the first part of the scene where these cloth surfaces are just nicely floating around the place, but then suddenly it's as if they're pulled into a circular motion, and they kind of cause turbulent pull into the atmosphere, which pulls all of the floating particles along with them, and it all looks very cool. It kind of almost looks like they're being jerked into this motion. So what are we going to do to create that look? Well, we're going to use a modifier, which is a little bit underutilized, really. It's a very interesting modifier, and it's called the Strange Attractors modifier. So let's just do a little bit of housekeeping here. We can collapse this, and let's rename it this null from cloner. We'll call this cloth objects. So now we know that that's our cloth objects. And this and these two effectors, we just made that to create our objects, and we don't actually need to be using these anymore. So I'm just going to hit Alt-G, which will group them in a null. And then let's rename this null cloth. I'll call it cloth generator. And I know not to use them, so I'll just make them invisible. All right, good. So that's looking a little bit more tidy now. Excellent. So we're going to be using the strange attractors. So let's go to the xParticles menu. We'll go to modifiers. It's a motion modifier, and here we have strange attractors. And if you don't know what strange attractors are, if you just Google them, you'll find loads of information and lots of videos explaining exactly what they are. But they're kind of mathematical equations, fractals, I think, and they are supposed to be chaotic, but as they move the particles in this chaotic manner, they kind of form these interesting patterns, and these interesting patterns via the velocities. And there's lots of different modes, and so you can see here we've got these different versions. Let's just set up an emitter so we can see these actually working. I might just... Let's just deactivate the cloth deformer. Let's deactivate the cloth modifier and the turbulence. Okay, and I'm just going to make invisible of those. So they're still in the scene, but we've just switched them all off. So now I'm going to bring in a fresh emitter, and this is just to demonstrate what the strange attractors modifier does. So by default, if I press play, this happens to the particles. And that's it. So the particles, even if I switch the speed off completely, makes no difference. The strange attractors modifier grabs them and sends them off into this pattern. And this is the Lorentz strange attractor. Now, Lorentz is a person that discovered the equation, or whatever the mathematical entity is that discovered this. But there's lots more different models. Rossler is a different version. And depending on the plane, it'll change the way in which these attractors look. Let's go to more Spiegel. It's an interesting kind of circular one. So these strange attractors provide all these different chaotic patterns. And as I say, read up on it on Google. It's very interesting stuff. So let's pick, we're going to use a Chen. And Chen's quite a good one because we get this whipping circular motion. And then we also get this kind of concentric circle cone that appears. So that's quite interesting. I think this is going to give us the initial whip of the cloth going into this circular motion. So within the strange attractors, we've got a few different controls. The scale is like an overall size control. So I'm dolly right out, and it's made this huge pattern. Let's put some more frames on our timeline. Let's go up to 300. So the scale is an overall scale for the entire scene. So look at this. It's an incredible formation. Delta is like a speed control. So it'll develop more quickly if we have more delta. Let's just put that down. I'll put the scale back down to what it was, 5. And then the strength, obviously it's self-explanatory, the strength. So if you reduce the strength, we can now start seeing that this is going to start making our cloth move in this way, which is pretty cool. So then we have max speeds and iterations or other settings that we don't necessarily need to think about. Now, the various different attractors have these things called constants. Some of them have only 3 constants, like Chen only has an A, B, and a C. Others have 6 constants. And if we make adjustments to these, you'll just see that it slightly changes the way in which those particles are moving. It's kind of like individual scale controls for different parts of the fractal and the way in which the noise works. So we put those right up. And we don't need to be scientifically accurate about this. We're not saying we need these precise settings to get this precise look. All we are doing is using this modifier to make our cloth material suddenly be whipped away in an odd kind of, hopefully, organic but circular motion. So we don't need to be that precise, but this one's looking quite interesting. So let's see how this is going to work in our scene. So I'm just going to delete that new emitter that I made, and I'm going to switch the strange attractors off for now. Let's make our cloth visible again. That's the wrong one. That's our cloth generators. Let's stick that at the top. So we'll put the turbulence on. In the cloth objects, we'll make this visible, and we'll switch on our cloth deformer. I will switch on my cloth modifier. Now we have got our turbulence happening. And if I then switch on this strange attractors, let's see what happens. And then suddenly they're whipped into a circular motion. And by doing very little, we're getting kind of the look that we want. Now, we haven't got our constraints active at the moment, so they're intersecting. But this is kind of the thing that we're after. So we're going to start with the strange attractors switched off. Let's switch it off there. So we're just having them float in the turbulence. We might be really close into these when it comes to render time. And then we're going to have suddenly a switch on, vroom, and they get whisked away. And then, so that's one. And then we might have another camera angle where they're kind of, let's say they're coming towards the camera in a circular motion, like that. So that's going to work well. And as I say, we don't need to be particularly sophisticated with this strange attractors. We're not using it mathematically. We're just using it to make these cloth objects go vroom. That's the technical expression. Right, so let's just animate that. We're going to animate this strange attractors on and off in the most basic way. Let's go to the basic tab, appropriately named, and we will go to frame, I don't know, let's say we'll go to frame 60 maybe. Let's say frame 50. So frame 50, and I'm going to keyframe it in an unenabled state. Let's go forward 1 frame and keyframe it on. So now we have got this has given us some developmental time before we get our wrinkles, and then boom, the strange attractor happens. Okay, so let's try that with the constraints active, which is going to be a lot slower. Let's just take those lines off. So this will animate more slowly because it's having to work out possible collisions between all of the particles on the same pieces of cloth and the independent pieces of cloth. But there we go, and then they start flying around the place, and that's looking great. And let's just have a look at our turbulence. Our turbulence settings are, I think we could increase the strength of this turbulence up a little bit. Let's try that again. So we're getting more kind of wrinkles now. That's good. And then here comes this strange attractor, and then they get whipped away and start forming this pattern. Okay, very nice. And let's just have a look at our pieces of cloth and see how they're doing. Now, these aren't very high resolution, this cloth. So the fewer subdivisions you have, the more likely you are to get intersections. But if you look here, these collisions are doing the constraint object is doing a pretty decent job. We've got one collision here, and that's about it, really. So not doing too bad. Right, so let's do our dust particles now then. Just before we go on to that, if you can see, we've got these kind of not very nice kind of Phong errors going on here as our plane has been deformed. We'll sort this out a little bit later, but this is due to the fact that if I hit ND for the lines, it's a very low resolution object, this. And so it just doesn't have enough polygons to make a nice deformation, and we're getting all of these horrible Phong shading weirdness. But we'll sort that out a little bit later, a very quick and easy way of doing that, which isn't going to slow down our render times. So before we do that, let's sort out our dust particles. So in the scene from the reel, what we had these bits of cloth floating around, but we also had some really nice floaty dust particles floating around as well. And what was great was when the strange attractor kicked into force, and grabs hold of the cloth and whips it round into this circular motion, the particles were jerked in that direction as well. And it was an illusion, but it made it feel like the cloth was creating a change in kind of the air pressure, and it was forcing the particles to flow around with them. It's like sucking them in almost. It looked really good, and it's mercifully, it's very, very easy to achieve. So what we're going to do, we'll bring in a new xparticles emitter, and this emitter, we're going to set it in the object tab to be a box, and the box we're going to make very big. Let's just guesstimate 3000 by 3000 by 3000. So that kind of looks all right. You want it to encapsulate all of your cloth. I'm going to go a wee bit bigger because the more I've got in the fore and the background, the better it's going to look once we get some shallow depth of field in there. So let's make that slightly bigger. So there's our box that's going to be emitting our particles. Great. So let's go to the emission tab, and we want to take away all the speed. We don't want any speed to these particles. And we only want them to be born on the first frame. So let's change the emission mode from rate to shot. And it's just going to shoot 1,000 particles in one frame. I'm not entirely sure what quantity I want just yet. I'm just going to put 10,000 for now. Make sure we've got full lifespan ticked, so it'll last the whole 300 frames. And the radius, again, I'm not entirely sure the radius yet. I'm going to guess at 5, and I'm going to give it some radius variation of 5 as well. So we've got loads of different sized particles. So before we hit play to see those, I'm just going to go on my display tab, and I'm going to change the editor display of the particles from dots to circles, and then this is going to give us a good idea of the variation of sizes. So the last thing we want to do actually before I press play is this. In our scene already, we have got two modifiers, the strange attractors and the turbulence. And we've also got these two cloth objects. We have got the cloth modifier, which is a bit like a dynamic object, really. And we've got the constraints object, which is a dynamic object too. And we don't want these dynamic objects interfering with our floating dust particles. It won't work. It's not right. So what we need to do is disclude the constraints and the cloth modifier from these particles. So let's go to the particles menu, and we'll go to the modifiers tab, and in the exclude box we're going to drag in the cloth modifier and the constraints. Right, so now we're ready to hit play. So there we are, we've got our particles and they're being moved around by the turbulence at the moment. And then when this strange attractors hits, they're going to be pulled around by that too. Okay. Good. So I think we've got way too many at the moment. So let's go into our emitter settings, into the emission. I'm going to put this down to 1,000, which we may adjust later, but I think that's going to be a better number. Yeah, that's looking much more just like floating bits of particles. So let's have a look a bit closer in. So hopefully when our strange attractors hits, it then pulls the particles in the same direction. And that's going to give this illusion that the movement of the cloth is messing around with the air pressure and causing its own turbulence, which is dragging these particles around, which is going to look really cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to give these particles a colour. So in the real scene, Mario gave them some really nice colours. I'm pretty sure these are Mario's favourite colours. We're going to go gradient parameter, and we're going to map the colours dependent on the speed of the particle, and we're going to make it an automatic adjustment, which means the slowest particle will be made blue and the fastest particle will be made white, and that will dynamically change as the speed of all of those particles changes. But let's just change this up slightly. So I think we will, on this knot, we'll go with an orange colour, and on this knot we'll go with a blue, and it may be a bit too vivid at the moment, but let's just see. So now we've got this variation of particles, and then as soon as it starts going quickly, they're all going to change blue very quickly. There, and they all become very, very similar in speed. Okay. I don't know if you noticed, there was a little bit of flashing there. Let's just bring in, I'm going to bring in a Cinema 4D sky object, and I'm going to colour it as black, just so we can see these particles a bit better. All right, so let's just do that again. And let's just pay attention to these colours. So they're changing as the particles are changing their speed, as dictated by both the turbulence and the strange attractors modifier. And then as this happens, they suddenly get whipped and they all become the same colour. But they're kind of flashing a little bit. And that's because they're all changing speed at virtually the same time and travelling at a very similar speed. And in the emitter, we've got it set to auto, which means it's always trying to map these colours kind of frame by frame to every particle. So instead of having auto, let's just give us a bit of wiggle room, and we'll put a max speed of, I'm not sure what it'll be. Let's just try 500, and let's just see if we just get a slightly smoother result with this. So most of them have turned blue, which makes me feel like most particles are moving at this max speed. So let's boost that to 600. And let's increase the minimum to 300. All right. So we've got a bit more variation now. Let's see what happens when the strange attractors kicks in. And then they all go blue, but we haven't got the flashing. Okay, so that's looking nice. That's fine. And they're all kind of following this same movement of our strange attractors. So that's going to look really cool when it comes to our final render camera angle, where we have our cloth that's kind of doing its thing, with our floating particles moving around, doing their own thing, and then as this suddenly jerks, the particles move along with that cloth. And that's going to look really good. Okay, so that's very quick and easy particle setup. So the final thing I want to do, let's just get rid of that sky. The final thing I want to do now is, I'll just disable the visibility of those particles as well. So remember I said that if we just dolly in, once these start to become deformed quite considerably, we're starting to get these jagged errors, and this is just because we haven't got enough geometry to smoothly deform it this vigorously. And with all deformations, the more geometry you have, the more polygons you have, the smoother and nicer the deformation looks. The problem with that is that it obviously has a cost in simulation time, and we've got this running quite smoothly, and let's just say that we don't want to have to mess around simulating with a really dense mesh. So what we'll do is we'll just do the old trick of using a subdivision surface. And so the way we'll utilize it is we will put this entire cloth objects null inside a subdivision surface. So to do that, I'll just bring one into the scene, bring it down here, and then drag the cloth. Actually, let's just put this on 1 and then 1. So it doesn't have to make any berserk calculations as soon as we drag this in. So let's drag my cloth object in. And then immediately you can see, look, those jagged lines have been hugely reduced with the inclusion of the subdivision surface. And if I go ND to display the lines, it's because we have more subdivisions. Even though the cloth object isn't having to calculate all of the cloth dynamics on these many subdivisions, it's just kind of smoothing it out after the event, which is really nice. So let's just hide those lines again. And let's give 2 subdivisions. And now we've got an even smoother mesh, and it's even denser. And now they've all but disappeared at all of those errors, and we're getting this really nice smooth mesh, which isn't moving much more slowly than it was when we had hardly any subdivisions. So it's a great trick. And what we can do is, in the editor, we can have 0 subdivisions, so we don't see it. So we're still going to get this working in real time whilst we're editing and sorting out our scene. But then when it comes to render time, we're going to get the nice smoothing effects. So it's going to look decent. Right, so I think we're about there, really. We have produced the cloth, we've animated it, we've created all of these clones, we've got it working with one cloth deformer, and then we're making it interact with the turbulence object and this strange attractors, and we've created those nice floating dust particles as well, which are going to move with a similar movement with our cloth. So this is where we're going to leave part 1 of this tutorial. In part 2, we'll set up some camera angles, we'll look at some materials built in Cycles 4D, and we'll then get some really nice, super crisp and beautiful looking renders. So that's it for part 1. So part 2 of this tutorial will be available from the INSYDIUM YouTube channel, so please go ahead and subscribe, then you'll get it as soon as it's released. In part 2, we're going to take this cloth scene and we're going to open it up in Cycles 4D to create some stunning renders. So until next time, I'll see you later.